Welcome to the Style Academy video on manipulating sentence parts. We assume before you start this video that you've got a good understanding of phrases and clauses and how they work together in a sentence. If you don't, go back and review our video on phrases and clauses and do some practice there and then come back to this one. What we want to accomplish in this video is to take a closer look at how phrases and clauses work together to create specific effects to enhance the meaning that we have. If we can grasp some of these concepts, we'll be well on the way to becoming better writers. We're going to look at this closely by focusing on one sentence from an op-ed published in the New York Times written by David Brooks. This is an op-ed about James Snowden, the NSA leaker from early in 2013. Take a minute, pause the video, and read this sentence through, maybe 2 or 3 times, and pay attention to what you notice about how it's put together. So what did you notice in this sentence? Here's something we hope comes out, and this is what we really want to focus on in this video. The core idea of the sentence is this little clause right here, that he, meaning James Snowden, appears to be a product. That's it. That's like the core piece of the sentence. But this is a long sentence. It's got a lot of stuff in it. So how is that all working together? How is it enhancing this idea? Well, let's take a look at what's here at the very beginning of the sentence. Notice that Brooks lists these adjectives: thoughtful, morally engaged. And he's using these to describe James Snowden. He sets these up before the main idea, and he prefaces them with this word, though, or short for although. Notice here how by positioning this at the beginning and prefacing them with this although, he's setting us up for a contrast. So although we've got this, comma, we also have this: Snowden appears to be a product. Then there's the bulk of the sentence that comes after this main idea, and it elaborates on the product and what David Brooks means by this product. It's a product of an unfortunate trend. And then he gives this colon to define this trend, a trend that really matters to David Brooks and has appeared in a lot of his writing, and he's going to elaborate on in the rest of this sentence. So this is a trend of atomization, a trend of loosening social bonds, and finally this big chunk of the sentence that talks about the growing share of young men who live in this land between childhood and adult. This is a well-crafted sentence. David Brooks has compacted a lot in here, but he's arranged it and he's ordered it purposefully to enhance the point that he's trying to make in the larger piece. To see how this works, let's think about the sentence this way. Any sentence is made up of a main idea plus some modifiers. Now, at the minimum, the sentence has to have this main idea, which is usually expressed in an independent clause. But most sentences are also going to feature some modifiers that add to or enhance that main idea or explain it. These modifiers are going to be phrases. Remember, phrase is just a bunch of words. Or they can also be clauses, a group of words that has its own noun and verb. But this is the basic makeup of the sentence. And if we look at it this way, we can think about how we structure, how we order and arrange these different pieces to achieve a certain effect. Let's start with some of the basic possibilities given to us by this way of looking at a sentence and how we put a sentence together. Let's start by looking at one that we like to call the opener. In this structure, we start our sentence with the modifier and set it off from the main idea. When we do this, we're setting some background or a context, or setting the stage even, if you will, for our main idea. We're introducing the main idea with this modifier. Another structure flips these and has the main idea come first in the sentence, followed by a modifier. Here, when we put the modifier last, we're going to implant that idea in the reader's mind as they move from this sentence to our next sentence. We want that modifier to linger, so we put it last. A third option is to split our main idea and have the modifier come in the middle. This casts the modifier kind of in a subordinate role, sort of like an aside or something that's parenthetical. Now these three structures are pretty basic, and we've seen them in a pretty basic form. But that shouldn't limit you as a writer. We can make these much more complex, and in fact writers often do. We can add additional modifiers. In fact, in a lot of writing, we're going to need to provide lots of modifiers to help clarify things about our main idea. In this structure, we've got a modifier in the opener position and a modifier in the closer. So we've got this opening modifier that sets some context, and this closing modifier that leaves an idea in the reader's mind. In fact, this is actually the basic structure of the David Brooks sentence that we started looking at the beginning part of this video. We can make all kinds of changes and additions to these sentences and move things around based on our purpose and what we're trying to communicate. Here we've taken the modifier and sort of scattered them among the main ideas. We can add additional modifiers. We could even add more than one main idea if we add another independent clause to this sentence. What we want you to see here is the possibility. All sentences consist of this basic structure of main ideas and modifiers. We can move things around, insert things, create patterns, all under whatever our purpose or our task is in the writing we're doing. Let's examine how these structures work in an authentic piece of writing. We're going to go back to the David Brooks piece, but we're going to pull some other sentences from his piece and show how they mirror these patterns we've just talked about. I encourage you to pause the video so you can read these sentences either before or after we talk about them. Here's the first. This is an example of a closer where we put the modifier in their closer position. So here's our main idea. He betrayed honesty and integrity. And then here's a modifier, which is actually in a positive, renaming honesty and integrity, or calling them the foundation of all cooperative activity. Brooks has a reason why he puts this at the end. This is the point he wants to emphasize here at the end while we move on to other sentences in his writing. Here's another sentence. This one showcases the modifier as an opener. Every time there's a leak like this, here's the context, the setting that Brooks wants to create. And it's sort of like a cause and effect thing here. Here's the context. Every time there's a leak, boom, this is what happens. The powers close the circle of trust. Modifier comes first, then main idea. Here's an example of the interrupter. We start our main idea, it's logical. Then we interrupt it with this idea of background and mindset. And then we continue the main idea about what Snowden, or why Snowden would sacrifice his career. Notice that this idea of given the background and mindset is cast into a kind of a parenthetical tone by placing it as an interrupter. Sometimes these interrupters help us be more conversational in our writing. Sometimes they help us connect back to previous ideas, which is part of what Brooks has done here. Finally, here's an example of multiple modifiers. We've got a modifier that leads into the sentence as an opener. Here's a modifier also at the end. Again, this closer modifier is another appositive. So here's David Brooks using these closers to try to connect to larger ideas. Notice that we get the context here. For society to function well, certain things have to happen. This is the way Brooks introduces it. Then he presents his main idea and then connects it using this appositive phrase at the end here to a broader notion of institutions and deference to procedures. I hope you're feeling comfortable at this point with this idea that we've got modifiers and main ideas and that we can arrange them in different ways, and that you're starting to pick up on some of the names like opener, closer, and interrupter. So let's do some practice. Let me preface this by saying that you should watch the video on sentence combining before you do this practice, because that's what we're going to work with. What we're going to do for this practice is take some pieces that we've heavily modified from Brooks's essay and have you put them together and experiment with some different options. Here's your first set of sentences. The red sentence represents your main idea. The orange sentence we want you to rewrite to be a modifier. Now, when you do that, try placing it different places. Think about putting it as an opener. Try it out as a closer. See if you can put it somewhere as an interrupter. We'd like you to try all three structures. And when you do so, think to yourself or talk with people that you're working with if you're in a class setting, and think about the change. What's different when we put this modifier in the opening position? What about when we put it in the closing position? What about if it's an interrupter? Pause the video now and put these two sentences together. Well, what did you come up with? Let's take a look at some of the possibilities here. Here's what we could do in placing the modifier as an opener. Notice that the fact that Snowden put his own preferences above everything else sets the stage in this sentence. It gets a unique emphasis when it comes first, and we connect everything else in the sentence back to this in a unique way. Of course, we could also cast it as a closer. And here, again, this idea of putting his preferences above everything else, that's sort of our conclusion. That's what we take with us as we move to the next sentence. We could also put it as an interrupter. And here you can see, again, how this phrase, putting his own preferences, becomes something of an aside, or almost parenthetical. Now, interrupters are portable, pretty portable, so you could have put yours in a couple of different places. This is where I chose to put mine. Now, after doing this yourself, you may be wondering, how did David Brooks do it? Well, here's his original sentence. You'll notice that he put his modifier as a closer, so that it stuck with us when we left that sentence. Here's a final point to consider in all of this. You might have been asking as we've gone through this practice, well, what determines whether something's a main idea or whether it's a modifier? If I've got a modifier, couldn't I make that into a main idea? Transform it into an independent clause? And the short answer is you bet. You're the writer. You get to decide what gets placed as a main idea in that independent clause or what becomes modifiers. And you make those decisions based on the rhetorical situation in which you're writing. So briefly, let's just take another look at this sentence. Could we rewrite this sentence and make our modifier, what's in orange right now, the main idea, and what's in red right now, our modifier? Pause the video and give that a shot. Rewrite this sentence. What did you come up with? Here's what I did. I took the idea about Snowden putting his own preferences above everything else, and I rewrote that as an independent clause. Right? This could stand all by itself. Then I took the short-circuiting phrase and I trimmed it a bit to turn it into a modifier. Kept it in that closer position. Of course, your modifier could go as an interrupter or an opener too. What we've talked about in this video is not simple. We've tried to make it simple, but it's not that easy. You're going to want to pay close attention as you read good writing to the choices that authors make in arranging the parts of their sentence. And as you write, you'll want to give serious consideration to the choices you're making as a writer in that same vein. We hope you've got a good instructor that will walk you through additional practice, some sentence combining, some paragraph unscrambling kinds of things that will help you make sense of these concepts, because this is the kind of stuff that writers really get good at as they work at it more and more. Good luck.